Hello, everyone, and welcome to the National Association of Geoscience Teachers webinar series. This comprehensive series is your one-stop shop for strengthening work in Earth education. Webinars in the series feature novel and innovative work in Earth education, research and pedagogy, new teaching materials, and the classroom and professional experiences of people like you. The NAGT webinar series is free and open to the public, and we encourage you to invite your colleagues to attend and join the discussion. On the screen, you can find a link to the webinar series, where you can find the webinar schedule, an archive of past events, and information on our sponsoring projects and programs. On the event page for today's webinar, you can also find the presentation slides, related resources, and after the event, a recording of today's webinar. To help us get a good recording, we ask that you leave your microphones muted and video cameras off. If you have questions and comments along the way, we encourage you to enter those into the chat box, which we'll be monitoring. To access the chat box, find the Zoom control bar and click on chat. I'm happy to present today's speakers, Sarah Fortner and Nancy McHugh from Wittenberg University, who will discuss engaging students with environmental justice, expanding student cross-disciplinary understanding and perspectives through collaboration, and examples of environmental justice network building that advance student and community outcomes. And with that, I will turn it over to Sarah and Nancy.
Thanks, Mitchell. I'm excited to talk to you all today. I know Nancy and I are we're excited to come together and think about this across disciplines, and that's an important thing to doing this type of work. I'm going to talk a little bit about sort of like nuts and bolts in terms of how I think about it from setting up curriculum. And then Nancy will give you some other insight into the network building pieces. So you may be familiar with this definition of the environmental justice from the EPA. I just wanted to put it up there for you all to see. If you haven't seen it, it's a good starting place to look for ideas for what environmental justice is. And I try to look at different ways that environmental justice is defined in order to identify, through that definition, what are some of the actions that you would take in order to achieve that definition. So fair treatment, meaningful involvement, thinking about populations that are most disempowered and how to empower them, looking across definitions and seeing what could I take from those definitions and then translate into my work as an educator. So here's one of the reports that I like to look at from the National Academies. This is a 1999 report. And this definition says that environmental justice requires coordinating among agencies and specific populations and communities of concern. And it talks about improving science and communication and communicating to the people who are affected by injustices. And then it also recommends looking at specific environmental hazards and vulnerabilities. And I think that's like, what's going to be tractionable here. How are we going to move forward to have something really specific in mind or to start working towards that? Because if you're going to rectify an injustice, you're going to need to identify, what's the barrier to justice. So looking at these and thinking about what does that mean for my work? And I think you can think about this across like our work as environmental or earth educators, working on hazards, water, climate, pollution. All these things require and have populations that are more vulnerable and more affected by the situation. And then also thinking more broadly than just what the EPA or government puts out and looking at groups themselves, like looking at what indigenous communities are saying, looking at what groups in your community are saying, and using that to help you find the sort of language of what's the action that my curriculum can unite around. So this definition also talks about engaging communities and designing solutions. And I think number 2 is really important, respecting multiple ways of knowing. And this seems to apply to going into any community you're unfamiliar with and not assuming that your perspective is the same as the community you're going into. And then thinking about what the community sets for its goal, its adaptation plan, and helping them achieve those goals. Because I think sometimes I'm often surprised at the things that I think might emerge as the central issue may not be at the forefront of community conversation. So really listening and trying to figure out what communities want and where they see themselves going, and seeing how can I fit my work within that. And then again, 4 and 5 are more about that network building aspect, and how you actually make the change by once you're doing it, you're probably not enough. So we want to teach our students some strategies for starting to build networks so that they can more meaningfully address challenges. And then I like this definition here because it actually has some very specific targeted activities rather than like overarching framework. There's specific action or implementation listed, which is reducing harmful emissions and seeking energy efficiency and clean energy, and then working toward community resilience and livability. And I really like this sort of like implementation focused definition, because now that I've been working on this more, I see a lot of these bullet points as what the literature is saying helps those in communities that are most affected move out of conditions that are inequitable and unjust. Things like being able to have transportation equity that tends to be an actual solution for issues like housing. And it's something that was new to me as a geoscientist, but thinking about these and looking at what are these categories that communities themselves are defining, there may be some basis for it that you don't understand yet, but can learn as you start to engage, or but it also gives you some traction and sort of what might be more effective. And then finally, I wanted to zoom out a little bit and think about this from like an international perspective and look at UN Sustainable Development Goals. And these goals are not met individually. You can't solve issues like poverty and climate change, or life below water, life on land, any of these sort of intersecting issues by working on one thing alone. You have to work with networks. You have to think about justice. You have to think about them together. And this is nuanced, hard work. But the more we can think across these goals, the more likely there are to be sustained by communities. So now that you're here, when you look at the frameworks that you know or the ones that I've talked about, what skills and habits do you see as central to environmental justice work? Or which aspects of environmental justice do you think will be the most difficult to incorporate into your courses, and why? So I'll give you all a little chance to type in there if you have some ideas. I'll pause. If I see some typing, I'll stay here for a little bit. If not, I'll move on. I know what time of year it is. All right, I'm gonna take the pause and move. All right, so these are the things that I pulled out and think about across things. Here are empowering and valuing community knowledge, giving students an opportunity to work in teams and learn from the team members that they're working with, perspective taking and trust building. So thinking about issues like privacy, culture, things like that as you're doing project work. Building a context for social change. So how do you, like this sort of like the actionable part, how do I actually think about this work as leading to a desired endpoint? And then transdisciplinary work or boundary spanning, working across sustainable development goals, or working in and with communities requires interfacing with people who are maybe come from different backgrounds or disciplinary perspectives, things like that. And then this is something that I think is important for educators to think about too, is the products that we have our students create when we're working for justice might be public-facing communication, and they might be helping the communities build literacy, and or helping them with their advocacy goals. And so it might look like infographics, fact sheets, reports, things like that. And when I look at a lot of the available service learning examples that you can look at online or justice examples in the curriculum, I don't see a lot of what does the product that students create look like at the end. So I think that's kind of a gap that we might work to try to fill as educators to get people inspired to do this work. Like, my students made this type of product that can help support this type of outcome. So I think that's kind of important work. That's how I've been thinking about it lately. And then also, this is something I've learned just by not realizing that situations are uncomfortable to my students, and then in retrospect, after engaging in the community, that realizing, they really weren't, maybe I should offer some time for some reflection here, because that activity was new, different, and it pushed the student to do something socially that was a little different than they had engaged in before. Okay, I'm gonna look a little bit at your chat after I've talked about mine. So I see a lot of people are having trouble seeing how to fit justice specifically into their courses, and that students need to know that justice is a thing. And then Katya says, as one who teaches primarily intro courses, finding opportunities for students is useful and meaningful is a challenge. Yeah, so thinking about scaling is important. So that's why I wanted to pull out these skills and habits too, because while I might talk about this as like a deep, long semester project, I think more about like entry points as how do you give students a traction with these specific goals and habits. And then the students who are most impacted are often the least aware and least empowered. Oh, that's a good point. And then teaching policy alongside traditional earth science material can be challenging. Very true, yeah. And then Kim, doing authentic engagement can be risky sometimes, and the outcomes aren't always guaranteed or controllable. And having departmental and administrative support might be important. Yeah, and I think that's definitely true. Like, you're understanding what the norms are at your institutional setting are really important to doing this. I think we have a little bit more latitude here in a liberal arts setting than you might have in a public four-year university or PhD serving institution where there might be different priorities. So yeah, it is good to have the support and to know how and think about how this fits with, aligns with your cultural norms at your institution. And I think a lot about that when designing and proposing these things, and the language that we use really matters too. Okay. So, here I am trying to move okay. So some of the skills and habits to include are how do you build perspectives and community trust. So we've done this working in workshops together with faculty. You can do this in class by just doing teamwork and giving students opportunity to share and get to know each other. In terms of learning about community perspectives, one entry activity is to just simply look at what are the top issues that keep reappearing over and over in the news, and to thoughtfully think about the intersections between community interest piece and the work that you're doing in your class. And oftentimes, this is where I see things like, stormwater's coming up as an issue of a huge expense for my community, or there's a new lead remediation program that will serve these people or do this, try to achieve this outcome. And I look at that and I think, well, I can map this thing, or I can do that. And I think about what the fits are with the things that I'm reading in the news as a good starting place. And I think that's probably, I didn't really see, normally I thought these are the top things I should be thinking about, the most important things in my discipline. But I think thinking about how do I fit those most important things in my discipline that I want to teach in my class to the issues that my community is really thinking and working around. And then I also think going and showing up at events and hearing from people in the community and thinking about intersections there. So in the top left here is a collaborator, John Wheeler, from the Springfield Promise neighborhood. And he grew up in this community and has been working to improve conditions for the kids that live in this asset-based poverty alleviation neighborhood. And he is a fierce advocate for his community and post a lot on their local Facebook. And so I look at that quite a bit to understand what are the priority issues for the Promise neighborhood. And then in terms of like, how can we engage our students that are working on earth environmental issues in more a deeper context? So I might be looking at water, or trees, or soils, or looking at pollutants or things like that. But how can I think about what the intersections are between that and the other conditions of a place, the social conditions? And this resource, the Opportunity Atlas, is absolutely fabulous. And the paper came out by Chetty et al. That talks about it, but it actually looks at social mobility factors for children. And it's mostly census data that you can look at a whole suite of factors like incarceration, teen pregnancy, income, and you can look at how children fare spatially and census tracts and see where conditions are most inequitable and unjust, and use that to think about, if that's what the social conditions are, what might I ask about soils, water, or the sort of things that I'm going to look at as an earth and environmental scientist. And similarly, I think some of you have probably seen already the EJ screen tool from the EPA. And this is kind of neat because a lot of people have issues looking at maps and interpreting them. But the EJ screen tool is set up so that you can view factors side by side. So as your students are learning things like units, they can look at like what the units are for a pollutant. They can come to an understanding of how does that pollutant compare to a demographic variable, like income or race, or look at something like that side by side and see things with changing color intensity, and that sort of guides the eye to the correct answer for what you're interpreting, what linkages you see between the two variables, because you can line up the hot spots a little bit. So it's kind of interesting. I like it as an entry point, and also as a way to, they can usually pick out the things that you want them to see in the social and environmental conditions pretty well. And then I think community development issues in the community, like how are we going to use land, that intersects with, where's water going, where's the pollution building up, what's the flux and fate of this environmental material, where are conditions more hazardous. So you can look at that and think about, here's an area that's vacant, hard surface that you might want to renovate for some stormwater purpose or to reduce the pollutant. But me saying, hey, this should be a rain garden may not be really rooted in what the community wants to do. And so trying to get an understanding of where and why, which development will work well. And if you're working in an intro course where it's hard to get out into the community, to look online, look at like city resources and see what is the city putting out as community development priorities. And then maybe looking between the lines and saying, what's not in those reports? Because oftentimes the environment and actually the race and the environment tend to be gaps in a lot of city reports. And then looking at initiatives, I think some things are more obvious fits for us working on earth and environmental issues. So I see sunflowers and I think soils, I think carbon cycle and water cycle. And I can see how understanding what the functioning of a place like this is could be valuable to proving that maybe we should do more of this. So looking at what's being done by partners in town to see if there are ways to connect students to this work to build momentum for it. And then the other thing, and I think this is something that I'm starting to realize a little bit more getting into it, is if you're working on a community challenge, be it stormwater, lead pollution, something like that, uh, you're looking at something that the conditions or the deterioration of your city's stormwater system took years. You had a capacity set up during a historical time when maybe it was established, and it was the top technology. And then now, as it's not quite right anymore, you have options that are based in the landscape and options that are based in policy and spending and community development, and all of those things require a lot of navigation. There could be code barriers to how you readjust or the landscape or the decisions that you make. So trying to make meaningful opportunities where your students engage in what those barriers are. And they look at other city models or other real examples of how these barriers were overcome. And so I often have my students, initially I was noticing a lot of times that there would be solutions proposed that would be, plant trees, they would work great here, or use this type of solar panel to address this energy challenge. And those recommendations would just come from generic sites, like a government agency for the US site. And they wouldn't really be aware of sort of the local situational barrier to the change, or the thing that would be most tractionable based on what the community was interested in. So trying to help students see and understand how they might get towards thinking about which ideas are more tractionable. And so doing this can be looking at papers, inviting partners into class. You don't have to do full-on projects, but just getting ideas on what perspectives are. Or maybe you're out soil sampling and you're canvassing to gain perspectives on how land's being used, and you're exploring policies. And then maybe you're looking at things through time and space, the historical conditions that set up the setting that you have and are dealing and working on your class with in terms of a project. And so one thing that we're doing now is situating our justice work in housing policy. And so some of you may have heard of redlining. I highly suggest looking at the Mapping Inequality Project. In the 20s and the 30s, the Homeowners Loan Corporation designated areas A, B, C, and D. And A was a very exclusionary, all-white area, and D was redlined, and most of the redlining or exclusionary practices and divestment in the community was based primarily on race. And as a result of that, there were poor mortgage practices after that caused more defaults and less investment by developers, and inequities perpetuated. So in my class, thinking about this, thinking about how to engage with the community around testing an environmental challenge. In this case, we look at lead pollution, but you could look at other things like fertilizer, you could look at tree abundance, you could look at any sort of parameter that you might normally look at in your course. And you can even look at things using Google Earth or something if you can't actually get out into the field. And then engaging with the community, and in this case we did lead testing at a local event called Promise Fest, and we've had partners come to class and share health perspectives on how to communicate. I think when you're dealing with a public health and trust issue, you want to make sure that students know how to navigate sensitive issues like environmental health. And this is where what Kim said is spot on. You want to make sure that your university is behind what you're doing and that you run your protocols by the right people, like health professionals, things like that. And so I use this after they do this engagement and understand that lead health issues are happening in the community, and here's the information the community needs to know. What are the ways I can help my students gain some disciplinary and justice skills? So I had my students gain GIS skills by plotting vacant housing in Springfield, Ohio. and looking at the density of those vacancies by the HOLC grade. And then after they gained those results or identified their findings from that GIS exploration, they put together an environmental justice report. And this is actually in direct response to a housing report that came out in our community that had no recommendations that were based on race and or the environment. Instead, they were mostly talking about the vacancy challenges and community development priorities downtown. And so we want to point out what are the options that actually specifically addressed injustices. And so what they did is they talked about the challenges of the community and the perpetuated environmental inequities. They showed figures that illustrated these, and then they made recommendations at that scale, or thinking about, what actually is going to fit with what we learned talking to and working in with the community. And put out reports. I think also when doing this work as curriculum, it's important to provide flexibility to students. We want to empower them. So when I look at my rubrics and projects, or anything you're doing in your class, what are the opportunities that you have to let your students bring their expression into this work? I can easily have my students make a GIS figure and show me they have mastered that skill, but maybe they want to use their artistic skills to create an advocacy product that would be more effective in the community, and they have that expertise. And so how can I look across my rubric and say, what are the ways that that I can have my students deliver these things that might be more impactful or helpful to my students and the community? I think reflection's also important. This work isn't always comfortable, so pausing and reflecting as an instructor and thinking about what's working and what's not. We want to push forward and do things that are uncomfortable, but we also want to make sure that we are energized by the work and it's meeting the goals that we set for ourselves too as faculty. And similarly, students need time to process this and think about the work they're doing and why. Why are we thinking about who's affected, not just making this map and saying, here you go, use it. So thinking about that and having students be thoughtful about it. And then thinking about ways to share products. And this is where I think there's a gap in a lot of civic work. So sharing products and how we make them so more can do this work. And then building networks to advance our goals, and those are goals for the community or goals you have working on this. Maybe you want to improve justice research and you want to have more scholarship. Find others that share that goal with you. Maybe you're working on a challenging issue and you need help navigating it. Find people who have that expertise, bring them in, and share your expertise with them. I'm going to point out this project, the Metal Redlining Network. Kim, who commented earlier, is on this project, as well as a few others. We decided together, motivated by justice outcomes, that we would ask a metal research question associated with redlining and explore it across cities. And we would do this because we are interested in this research, but also because we all have our own justice goals for ourselves as advocates or for our students and their learning in our classes. And so we're working on this shared research question so we can elevate our scholarship, but we will also achieve this whole other web of interactions in our communities, and we are resources for each other because we can share, the things that we're navigating working on an environmental issue that intersects human lives. So if you're really interested in this project, feel free to go ahead and look at the website, and there's a comment section. We're trying to figure out where to build the capacity into the future, what it might look like to scale this more. So we'd be excited to hear from you if you're enthusiastic about the project. So thinking about this, what ideas do you have for designing your class that are most comfortable to you? What would be a stretch or could expand the impact of your course or teach you something that you want to learn that might be a little uncomfortable? So think about that, maybe share some of those things, and I'll try to type back a little bit while Nancy's talking. I think my time is up. Wow. I'll pass it on.
Just switch seats. Okay, this works. Hello. Thanks for having me here today. So let me adjust these little earpieces a little bit here. Okay. So a lot of you know Sarah from working in geoscience, but most of you will not know me. So I'm a philosopher by training, and I work specifically in health justice. I'll tell you some of the kind of work I've done. So my work is really interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary. I was just out to lunch with somebody, and I was working on some criminal justice reform, and they told me I was an odd philosopher. A lot of my teaching is community engaged teaching with a base in philosophy, but then also really kind of reaching across through different disciplines. So the kinds of project-based learning I've done or community engaged learning I've done in my classes are in my science and social context class. We did a community-based project on an EPA Superfund site. And we ended up partnering with a local community action group called People for Safe Water. The US EPA came in and met with my classes several times, and they actually were part of the report that the US EPA ended up writing up about the site. We worked with a water hydrologist, the Combined Health District. We went and visited the EPA Superfund site. And then what ultimately my students ended up doing is writing white papers that were then disseminated to the US EPA and to the local community action groups, so they could actually use that as part of their framing and response to the US EPA. I also teach philosophy courses in prisons, juvenile detention centers, with reentry programs. I just finished doing 2 courses that were meeting in middle school or high school and an elementary school. What I do is I take students from my university. So for example, in my prison courses and my reentry courses, we'll meet for the full 15 weeks this semester with usually 15 or so students from my university and 15 or so people who were incarcerated or formerly incarcerated. So my students are put in a lot of situations that are really uncomfortable for them. In the prison setting, of course, it's uncomfortable for the students that are incarcerated too, right? And the same thing with the reentry program. So there's lots of conversations about how to think about dealing with that uncomfortable situation, but also why sitting with one's discomfort and reflecting upon it and engaging is really important and valuable. Okay, so let me get going. So there's been a move in philosophy. So for years, when philosophers talked about justice, we talked about ideal systems of justice, right? So we talked about what perfect justice systems look like. And many of us have realized that's not a very fruitful way for going, especially when we're surrounded by a lot of injustice, right? So what we've learned is to think about what justice might look like in non-ideal situations. So environmental justice is always presenting us with a non-ideal situation, or we wouldn't be engaging it in the first place. And so it's a really nice starting point for thinking about systems of justice and how to use the kinds of skills that we can build as philosophers, but also collaboratively across communities, whether they're academic communities or local communities or institutions and structures, to think about what does the injustice look like and what might justice look like in this situation. So what that requires is thinking about how to engage diverse perspectives in problem solving. So I'm going to talk about 3 sort of initial strategies for engaging in problem solving and thinking about environmental justice and how to go about embedding a concept of justice within one's work. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to move, and within that process, I'm going to talk about a project that Sarah and I and several others are collaborating on, which is also on redlining. It's focused on Springfield. And that'll be integrated into my discussion of these diverse perspectives in problem solving. And then from there, I'm going to move on to sort of finishing up with talking about something that philosophers refer to as epistemic virtues. And I think they're helpful for thinking about, and a lot of you probably think about them on your own and don't maybe realize that you're thinking about these. So initial strategies for planning a just engagement and community outcome is, so first your planning needs to be grounded in the specific injustice. So again, when we're talking about justice or injustice, if we're talking about either ideal situations or universal situations, we actually really aren't talking about what justice looks like on the ground. And so we have to think about the specific injustice, the specific communities, and the specific needs. So I'll talk about that in just a second. And then second, given the specific injustice, which community experts need to be at the table? The foundation of the starting point should be the community in which the injustice has been experienced. And that's really hard for us as academics, I think, is our starting point, but it's the essential starting point. So I'll talk about that a fair amount. And then given specific injustice, which academic experts and disciplines need to be at the table? And I think in almost, especially with environmental injustice, and especially because you're working with marginalized populations, this really has to start from a transdisciplinary perspective. And I'll talk about that some too. So Sarah and I are in the very, very early stages of working on an environmental justice project. And the name we've come up with is Redlining Education and Change Coalition, REC, which is really sort of nice because it is a bit of a REC. If you look here, this is a map of poverty in Ohio by county. We are Clark County, which is in the sort of cursor on it. Yeah. Sorry. So if you look at it, so we are in the bottom left-hand corner of your screen, not only the bottom, but we're one of the yellow counties. And so the counties, the highest level poverty counties, are in red. And if you'll notice, most of those are the Appalachian counties, and you know, counties with histories of coal mining and a range of transitionary employment that has led to incredible rates of poverty. Our county is in the next level, which is the yellow, 15.9% to 19.9% in terms of poverty. So if you look at our county, we're at 18, we're at 18.6. We have a high level of poverty and a high level of income distribution. So there's a fair number of people at the higher end of the spectrum in terms of income, and a lot of people at the low end of the income range in our county, and a lot of people with intergenerational poverty. And one of the Sarah's typing at the same time, so there you go. So one of the challenges here, for example, are things like poor high school graduation rates. You can track the poor high school graduation rates in our county to the elementary schools, which are that are having poor third-year reading scores, which is tracked right onto the areas that have historically been redlined. So you can track the redlining to poor educational outcomes, and then as those students transition from the high schools, from the elementary schools and into middle schools and into high school, they are also having low graduation rates. They also are having higher detention rates in the juvenile detention center and higher rates of incarceration. So we can track each of those things along. So, oops, can you change the screen for me?
No, I took care.
That's okay.
Right here.
No, we're okay. We got it. Okay, that's okay. Okay, so I'm going to tell you about this. Sarah and I are multitasking here, so we apologize for that a little bit. We're sharing a screen. Okay, so with our redlining project with REC, we have some initial goals, and they're up here. I'll read through them, but obviously you can read them also. So now, these are initial goals that were set up by those of us who are really invested in this project, but these are really preliminary goals. And the reason they're preliminary is we have not had a broader community conversation about this. These initial goals are framed because Sarah and I and several other folks that have framed them work very closely with communities, but they have not had direct community input. So at some point we're going to have really a pretty deliberative conversation with community members to get to understand and develop a set of goals, but you need a starting point, you need a springboard. And so this is an initial springboard that will get substantially reevaluated. So And they really represent our goals for starting off, not necessarily for how we continue on. So first, we strive to raise awareness of the structures and practices that have resulted in racial inequities and injustices in Springfield, Ohio. This includes redlining, racial covenants, and other examples of policies and practice of systemic oppression that perpetuated racism and a social chasm. Key, starting from the perspective of community partners, and I'll talk a lot more about who those community partners might be, but some of them are listed here. We're going to work to prioritize goals and repair breaches and address inequities. So the outcome is really sort of broad-reaching social change. And then we'll create and share research and resources in collaboration with our community partners, but also with broader constituents, and with, again, the hope of implementation and change. So if we start the first thing I laid out, which is understand the nature of injustice. If we think about the redlining example and REC, one of the first things we need to think about is, so what is the nature of this injustice? The nature of the injustice is a significantly racially and economically segregated city. Marginalized members of the community have inadequate access to services such as grocery stores and banks, exposures to high levels of environmental contaminants such as lead, a disproportionate share of waste haulers and waste disposal, subpar housing, schools, and roads. So there's lots of ways you can think about this, but one example is adequate grocery shopping is really low in these areas. The only full service liquor store and a grocery store is actually in one of these redlined areas, which is interesting because, for example, in some of one might see in some high income communities embedded liquor stores. But one also tends to see in very low income communities the same sort of thing, embedded liquor stores, right? And so it's the only one within our area. So there's a disproportionate lack of fresh food and high proportionate access to alcohol. There's a lot of payday loan stores in the area. The schools tend to be lower performing. Almost all the waste haulers are located in these areas. And as Sarah has pointed out with her metals and redlining project, there's high levels of high blood lead levels in these areas among children. We have a pretty good public combined health district here, which really actively assesses blood lead levels. But it actually isn't all that easy to access. So really, the combined health district isn't in the areas of town in which that have the high blood lead levels, and nor is it easily accessed by public transportation. And so, though it's important that we have an active and ongoing assessment of blood lead levels in children, they don't necessarily have substantially easy access to that. Okay, so this is again the map that Sarah had put up, and again understanding the injustice, and Sarah did a really nice job explaining not only redlining but also what redlining looks like in our community. So the next question we need to ask ourselves to understand the injustice: is the injustice connected to a long history of other injustices in the community? And that very much is the case. So it's tied to obviously the 20th century redlining practices. But one of the things that's important to think about is, in many cases of injustice and poor health outcomes, one of the things we see are sort of short-term and long-term historical pathways in which that reflect both sort of close and distant experiences of communities and individuals. So when we see high blood lead levels, for example, or we see high levels of mercury or a number of other, or high rates of asthma among people, or high rates of breast cancer in marginalized communities, these are reflective of, again, these historical pathways that that shape health and shape the proximate individuals' experiences. So the health needs of these communities are frequently greater than the health needs of empowered communities. And this is precisely because of a series of injustices they've experienced over and over again. And so one of the things that we know is that marginalization in general leads to poorer health outcomes. And so when we think about understanding the nature of the injustice, these injustices are sort of multi-layered, and each of these layers, it's not just that we see like an additional impact on its own. Each of these impacts magnifies each other. It's a little bit like if you think about biomagnification, maybe we need to think about magnification of injustice. So just like when we think about, we might eat fish that has mercury in it, and each time, and that fish is eating smaller fish with mercury, and that fish is eating smaller fish with mercury, and each time it goes up the food chain, the mercury biomagnifies until it gets into our bodies and has a substantially stronger effect because it's biomagnified of the food chain. Well, injustice works like this too. It's not just that we're adding poverty on a voter disenfranchisement and poor access to food and poor access to schools and engagement with high lead environments. Each of those things expands upon the other in a way that's again, wrong word here. It biomagnifies, it magnifies over again. So that's really important to think about when we're thinking about alleviating injustices. We just can't, our crosshair can't be a microcosm or a small problem. We need to think about the ways in which they're layered. So do these other injustices also need to be tackled, or is the environmental injustice a residual of past injustice? So in the case that Sarah and I are looking at with redlining, so yes, there's a series of other injustices that have to be tackled at the same time. Again, this goes back to my biomagnification analogy, that that it's exponential. That was the word I was looking for. It's exponential. And so we have to, so for example, one of the things we know about high blood lead levels is that typically we see high blood lead levels in children who also lack access to nutritious food. So we know, for example, that calcium serves as a buffer for lead. Right, and so children who have low calcium diets, children who tend to not have access to breakfast, for example, those children tend to have high blood lead levels. And so it's one, that they have access to lead because it's in their environment, and two, they don't have access to food. And so you put those two things together and you're seeing high blood lead levels in children that you might not, in situations which you might not see them otherwise. And so part of tackling one issue is thinking about what would it mean, for example, to have, an abundance and easy access to full service grocery stores that had affordable, nutritious food, right? As opposed to, for example, in many low-income communities, what we see, for example, is a series of corner markets. In Dayton, which is the biggest city next to where we live, one of the things that they're doing in terms of thinking about the relationship between food justice and environmental justice is they're forming a food co-op. I believe it's going to be called Gem City Food Co-op. And so they're forming a food co-op, and they're intentionally locating it in a largely African-American, low-income part of Dayton, in an area in which there is poor access to food and food resources. And it's going to provide nutritious and low-cost food to the community. They're going to partner up with CSAs, they're going to partner up with local dairies and bread makers, and they're going to provide a service that just isn't being provided in their own community. So one of the things that's really important is locating, this goes to item 2 on my first initial list, locating your work in and through communities. So principles of justice involve recognizing that people that have been the subject of injustice need to be actively engaged at the very beginning of framing research questions and practices that will affect them, even those research questions and practices that are working to benefit their community. So even though we might be working to benefit the community from the outside, what really needs to happen is these questions and this engagement needs to start from the beginning. So let me give you an example of, and then I'll tie this back into what Sarah and I are working on, is I just came out of a meeting to talk with people about re-entry from prison. And the group that people never talk about reentry with, so people will talk about wardens, prison wardens, they'll talk about directors of prisons, they will talk with judges, they will talk with lawyers, but nobody ever talks about to people who've been coming out of prison to ask them what they need in terms of reentry. And so what that means is, in fact, reentry from prison is not very good. And so one of the things we've done is we've partnered with a reentry program, and this gets a reentry program for women, and we've sat down and had a conversation with them. What is it that you want from reentry? What would good reentry look like? And what is it that you need? And so now we're building a broader base where we're starting from the foundation. Our starting point is people who are coming out of prison and having those conversations with them. And we'll be talking with people who are in prison. And after we develop that base, then we're talking to their families, we're talking to churches and community groups, and we're layering it up. And then from that layering up, we then go to prison wardens, we then go to directors of prisons, we then go to judges and lawyers, and then larger governmental structures from there. And so in thinking about any point in which you're engaging in justice, especially with marginalized communities, starting from that marginalized base is really important, because that's really where a lot of the answers lie, and a lot of the insights that are going to generate an understanding of what needs need to be met and how best to meet them. And that's in part because communities tend to have much more intimate knowledge of their physical location, their needs and their outcomes. And then when we layer that together with our understanding, we get a much more textured starting point. So looking at the example that Sarah and I are working with, so given the nature of the injustice, which community experts need at the table? So this would include members of some of these groups and organizations, and a lot of them are listed here, but so residents of the roughly 9 redlined neighborhoods, and that needs to be diverse representation. And so one of the challenges that frequently happens, and this happens significantly less so, is we tend to see when we do engage communities a homogeneity of community representatives, and really important voices tend to get left out. So for example, one of the things that I found is actually the voices of teenagers are very valuable in understanding what's happening to in social problems, and that's in part because they're at a sufficient age in which they've sort of developed a series of critical skills, but they're young enough to have insight about what happened to their childhood. They understand the sort of family dynamics, and they understand larger social dynamics, and they understand what kind of life they aspire to live. And so teenagers, for example, are really underrepresented in many community discussions. So are people with ability and disability. So one of the questions we rarely ask about redlining, for example, is how does it disproportionately impact people with disabilities? And it significantly does. They have significant less access to transportation, right? Because their transportation needs are higher, right? In terms of how they are going to get onto transportation, get places, and get things. Their transportation needs tend to be higher. We tend to not look at a range of occupations. So frequently we do community engagement. We reach to the highest level of occupation within any given community. And that actually really is going to give us a pretty narrow understanding of who we should be working with. Race, we want racially diverse representation. With our redline communities, one of the things you can see is, though they start as historically African American, they actually have had a large Appalachian migration into our area of Ohio because of job opportunities at one point that have actually subsequently been lost. So some of these communities are much more racially integrated than they were historically in the 1920s and 1930s, but the poverty demographic has stayed the same. So in our community, you're going to see some heavily African American communities living in poverty, but you're also going to see some heavily integrated communities who are experiencing some very similar challenges and are in a very similar economic situation. And then Sarah talked a little bit in her part about social institutions and structures. So these include churches, mosques, and NAACP. So there's the health committee, the community committee. Sarah talked about the environmental committee. There's a labor and industry committee. We have a local organization called Think Tank that works directly with families living in poverty, especially on nutrition, but also on the move out of poverty. We have a foundation called the Springfield Foundation that's really focused on shifting the social geography, I would say, of Springfield, and embedded within them is something called the African American Community Fund. And there's also an arts project for at-risk youth that engages children from many of these communities, and the children they engage are really from pre-K all the way through to high school, and then they partner with many of these kids after they graduate to come back and work for them. And then again, the government and health institutions, many of which I think are really obvious, but the Combined Health District, Jobs and Family Services, Metropolitan Housing, and the Zoning Commission, those are all really instrumental in terms of thinking about how we would do something like this. So I said earlier that part of what we need to think about is how to start from the perspective of communities. And this is really hard when we're working with our students, but these are habits. Actually, as Sarah talked about habits also, but habits that we can instill in them. And so marginalized populations, so groups that due to racism, sexism, classism, ableism, ageism, globalization, all these things lay outside mainstream culture, have had little influence on framing research questions and funding and participating in research about their lives. So researchers, all of us have agency and accountability about how we go about framing our research questions, whether they're research questions embedded in our classes or whether they're research questions embedded in our own personal research. And so we have a level of responsibility in terms of how we do that, and we have agency in how we do that. We should be sharing that agency with community members. And so one of the ways, so if we think about the fact that the most marginalized populations in our country and in our regions are those that are frequently the subject of study, yet have very little, have been engaged very poorly in terms of developing research questions about their lives, participating in funding structures, and participating the trajectory of research. We can really see, are we getting close on time? We can see this is really challenging. So I'm actually going to move ahead for a few slides because I want to talk about this sort of last component to this. And this is actually thinking about some principles and practices of what we refer to as epistemic virtues. And so just like we have moral virtues, so we think of moral virtues as trustworthiness or kindness, or reliability. In philosophy of science and the epistemology of science, we also like to talk about what we refer to as epistemic virtues. And these are really key. And these are habits I think we can work to establish and within our students. So epistemic humility is a really important one. It's reserving judgment, resisting hasty generalizations or aggregation, pausing before superimposing simplistic readings onto complex situations. So epistemic humility really requires us to step back and understand that we are not always the authorities in our research area. And that means, again, recognize the importance and agency of communities. The second is epistemic diligence and curiosity. That's recognizing that we might not know what we think we know, and that involves sort of employing some epistemic humility and working to recognize the gaps in our knowledge. And the third really is open-mindedness. And I think this is actually the starting place for working with our students. Is so a willingness to attend to and consider multiple points of view that might conflict with our own. It's important for our students and ourselves to experience friction in terms of what we think we know and what we are authorities on. And if we can sort of start from this place of open-mindedness, it allows us to cultivate some epistemic humility and some epistemic diligence and curiosity. Okay, I'm going to just jump to the last slide. And I realize we're really out of time. But Sarah and I can reply to your chat as we go along. So what do you think are the biggest challenges for you to embed a framework of justice in your community engaged teaching and research? and which epistemic virtues do you think you possess? Which do you think you need to develop more to be effective in your community engaged teaching research? Okay, thank you. So we'll pause for a few minutes to see if you have any questions or chat, and then we're pretty close on time.
If people have things that they want for resources.
There we go.
So thanks very much, Nancy and Sarah, for today's presentation, and a thank you to everyone who has participated in today's webinar. We encourage you to check the NAGT webinar page soon. We'll have our spring webinar series listed up there, hopefully sometime soon. We also encourage you to consider your department course or program for the NAGT Traveling Workshops program. We encourage you to join us at the 2020 Earth Educators Rendezvous this year in Palo Alto, California. If you'll be at AGU next week, come visit us in the exhibit hall. We'll be at booth 314. And we always appreciate your ideas and feedback. And if you have a few extra minutes, please fill out the evaluation survey, which I've linked to in the chat box. And again, thank you all for coming, and hopefully we'll see you at a future webinar.
Thank you.